Okay, hey everybody, welcome to another episode of On the Wrist from Off the Cuff. Today we have another little review for you from the brand Spinnaker, a little bit about them. They're basically a smaller brand that's offering classic nautical designs, at a very affordable price and a very modern package. So this particular type of watch is of course a dive watch. Some key common characteristics and design language when you're looking for a dive watch. You're going to find, of course, our water resistance, normally through some type of screw down crown. You're going to want something tough, legible, with some type of dive time bezel. And then, of course, if it is on bracelet, it's always nice to get a diver's extension. Now, this particular model is actually kind of a retro compressor inspired diver. And I believe there was actually an original version, and they did revise it later on. It's the Bradner. So with that said, let's go ahead and take a closer look. Okay. So as you can see, really cool color palette on this one. Really digging that deep blue dial. Definitely with that cool sunburst. Really high contrast. As you can see, it appears very much black, and then you get the reflections in there, and you can even see a little bit of that AR coating underneath the crystal there, which I think plays really nicely. Now, the retail price on this is $285 direct from Spinnaker. The dimensions flashed across the screen earlier, but very briefly, it's 42 millimeters in diameter with a 51 millimeter lug to lug width, and then a 15 millimeter height. So it's, not the thinnest, but definitely not the thickest for a diver. I do think, they did break it up a bit by having that mid case look very thin, and then kind of having the upper bezel and the case back protruding a bit more. So a little bit of an equal kind of 3/3 kind of approach there. Not completely to scale with being three equal sections, but you can see that there was definitely an effort made there to really break up those lines. Now, of course, you can see that this is pretty much an all brushed case. It does have the polished crowns there, but pretty much everything else is brushed to include the buckle there, which is nicely milled, although the arm here, the finger in the middle, is pretty much just a formed piece versus being something that was machined. So for the crystal, it is a sapphire. It's flat with actually kind of a boxed edge there, so not quite pronounced as like a full-on box dome, but it's flat and then kind of has the rounded boxed edge there, which I think is really nice and does add a little bit of visual interest right at the ends without really affecting legibility too much at all. So you can still read it very well at different angles. Now, of course, it does have that internal bidirectional bezel. I think there's a fair amount. It's not something that's you're gonna accidentally, move around too much. But of course, when you do need to turn it, it is quite turnable. But I've definitely felt more slippery slide bezels than that. So pretty good, and it definitely has this really cool kind of three-dimensional look to it because it's not just printed on there. It's definitely like a 3D kind of machined look there to it. I don't know if it's metal underneath or it could be plastic, but it's definitely three-dimensional. As you can see, everything's raised, so it just adds a little bit more visual play, which is nice, and I think it definitely makes it look a little bit more modern and does give you more visual play there, kind of everything working together when you got the edge of the crystal, and then you do have those very large three-dimensional markers and indexes all the way across that inner bezel. Now it does have two crowns here. You can see one for the slide bezel, and then one also for the movement, which would be it's the NH35, very familiar movement, as you can see here. It's made by Seiko. You have the see-through case back so you can see it really nicely. Hacking, hand windable, 3 hertz movement versus the 4 hertz. So it's only going to be ticking 6 times each second versus 8 times. So not quite as smooth, but I think totally good enough, especially at this price range, and a very reliable and super cheap movement. So almost to the point to where you can just replace it versus actually worrying about having it regulated or anything like that if anything goes wrong with it. Now, the dial, of course, is really nicely done. You do have the applied indices there, and you have that really cool raised logo and a high polish, and the hands are very nicely brushed there, so it does add some nice contrast, and they always catch the light really nicely versus it's really, even at this angle, it's hard to make the hands disappear because they're brushed versus polished, so they're still going to grab light even in low light, which I think is a very nice touch. Now, we do have that date there at the 3 o'clock, which is really nice, nicely framed. I'm glad that they went with a black date disc because, you know, it's a white number there. There's also white font. I think it's just flows a lot nicer. And of course, because of that dark dial, it really plays and ties in very, very nicely. Now, the Superluminova that's on here, they don't really get too much into the details, but as you can see, it does have a bit of a green tint to it. There is also variants that are available with kind of a patinaed tint. This one definitely has the more clean, modern aesthetic to it. And the water resistance is actually a bit odd. It's 18 atmospheres or 180 meters or 600 feet. So not quite a 200 meter diver, but more capable and robust than a 150 meter watch. So, you know, definitely interesting choice there, but it's about as waterproof as you need it to be for pretty much any situation, unless you're a full-on legitimate diver. Now, of course, the lugs are 20 millimeters, which I think is really great because it gives you a lot of different strap options. But the strap here is actually pretty cool. It's this genuine leather strap that's actually been waterproofed, so it's very water resistant, and basically you can get it very wet and it's not going to really hurt the strap too much. It has this nice kind of ivory stitching there, kind of tying in with the vintage theme. So with that said, let's go ahead and get this piece on wrist. Alright, as you can see on my 7¼ inch wrist, this wears really well. Of course, it does appear bigger because it does really have a thin actual outer bezel there, and that inner bezel pushes all the way to the edge, which really opens up the dial and make the dial appear much bigger than it actually is, which if you just look at kind of where the indices are and the actual blue portion of the dial, it actually is quite a bit smaller. So it does add that extra dimension, but you know, at a glance, it definitely appears to be a larger watch, and it does wear a bit larger. Oh, the camera's taking a second to focus there. But as you can see, wears really well. I get a little bit more of my arm in there, you can see, and then you can take a look at the height. You know, this is kind of in the category almost where you would see a chronograph, so it's definitely not something that's wearing super close to the wrist, or, you know, super slidable under the cuff. So it's a little odd, of course, for them to have it this thick with only 100 meters water resistance, but I'm sure that has to do with that inner slide bezel and kind of keeping everything watertight, being a little bit more complex, especially at this cost. So I'm sure there's some things that they couldn't really afford to probably you know, design down and flesh out to really make this something that was going to be wearing a little bit more svelte for that lower water resistance. But I gotta say, it really plays with the light well. As you can see, even this black strap, it does give you kind of hints almost of a midnight blue when the light hits it just right. And then you do have that AR coating that does play well with the dial as well. So alright, so let's go ahead and check out some lume shots. Alright, let's go ahead and hit the lights. As you can see, the lume is actually pretty decent. And on that outer portion there, it definitely isn't going to shine quite as bright. Actually, I'm going to hit it real quickly here with the black light. give you a little bit of a better idea of how this is going to look. So although those are three-dimensional, you know, it is pretty much a kind of a machined out piece there, and then it has loom on top, so it's not like pure chunks of loom there, which, you know, in the daylight it actually appears to be much brighter than it does here. But I think that also does tie into the fact that this isn't, you know, a super deep diving, really tool oriented diver. Right now we're doing some low light transition because of course my hot studio lights do a good job of simulating, you know, pretty much full on direct sunlight, but you're not always going to be in direct sunlight. Sometimes you're going to be coming in and out of your vehicle, in and out of a building, so you're going to have it in much less optimized lighting conditions. One of the nice things also that you'll see here with the low light transition is you can actually see the way that the light plays off of the finishing. So you can see that it is pretty uniform there in the brushing. Of course, nothing luxurious about the finishing on this piece, but definitely feels more like a purposeful tool watch, sports watch. Wouldn't call it like a hardcore diver by any means, but you know what, it definitely gives you the look for a lot less, and it's definitely something that is actually reliable and water tested, which I can appreciate. So, you know, with that said, I don't know how many they have of these. They do kind of do these in runs. I haven't checked the website lately, but they do normally kind of sell out as they do certain batches. But I think it's pretty decent wear. It actually reminds me a lot of kind of my blue Alpinist from Seiko, even the strap, and it just has a very similar kind of aesthetic to it, but it's kind of the blue Alpinist meets Compressor diver, so it's kind of like a mishmash of those two worlds, and it gives you a little bit more size. So let's say Seiko Alpinist was a bit small for you, and it is, I'm not gonna lie to you, it has a small dial, and it wears a bit small. So if you are larger wristed, 7.5 inches or larger, maybe this is the watch for you, and you know, because that blue Alpinist just wore a little bit too small. So, you know, on the wrist, it definitely has a very bold wear. It has tons of presence and personality. Definitely that kind of sporty retro vibe comes across very clearly. Model variants wise, there's of course black and blue dial options, and then they have basically a yellow or green loom color, depending on which variant you get. And then there's also a black case with green dial option. Now, as far as comparables go, I can't really think of too many in this price range. You know, definitely feel free to let me know in the comments below if there's some kind of compressor style watches that are in that below $300 range that have hacking hand windable movement, and then also are decently water resistant and isn't just 100% for the looks. You know, at that 180 meters of water resistance, I think that's still pretty good. Bottom line, you know, this is really their, like I mentioned before, it's kind of their take on Seiko's blue Alpinist meets a kind of a compressor diver. You know, probably the most famous one you can think of would be like the Longines Legend. So it kind of is infusing those two different DNAs. It definitely has a little bit more of the Legend divers. I'd say its proportions being a bit larger, so that's kind of where that mishmash goes. And you know, it's a cool little watch. You know, Spinnaker sent this over. I've been meaning to get a review out for it. I think, you know, these have been kind of making the rounds, so I'm glad I was able to kind of sit down with this piece and take a look at it, because, you know, it's a decent watch. And of course, if my personal tastes weren't in more expensive watches, this is definitely something I could see myself wearing kind of in the beginning of my journey, back when I was really heavily into kind of Orients and kind of some of Seiko's lower end models and that kind of Seiko 5 category. So with that said, let me know what you guys think in the comments below. And if you liked the video, hit like, and if you haven't already, please subscribe for more content just like this. Thanks, guys.